Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Brief Lives. Now, Brief Lives is a graphic novel written by Neil Gaiman and illustrated by Jill Thompson and published by Vertigo, which is an imprint of DC Comics, and this is the 7th graphic novel in the Sandman series. Now, the Sandman is a dark fantasy comic book series that Neil Gaiman wrote for DC and Vertigo, and it was published between the years 1989 and 1996, and later on all the issues of the series were collected into 10 volumes. Now, there were 2 more Sandman graphic novels after the initial run, as well as a Sandman novel. Now, I've already reviewed the first 6 volumes of this series, and I'll leave links in the description below to where you can check out those reviews. Now, the series follows a group of celestial beings called the Endless, who I always assumed were older than the universe itself. However, that kind of gets contradicted in this particular volume of the series. They're at least as old as the first life in the universe. The reason I always made that assumption is because throughout this series it states that the Endless are older than any of the gods, and the Judeo-Christian God does exist in this universe, and I always took it that they were older than the God that the Christians believe in, who is apparently the God that created the universe. Then again, the mythology of this series is obviously not following Christianity to a T, but whenever God is mentioned in this series, or in other stories that are in the same continuity as this series, God is referred to as the Creator. However, the main concept of this series is, what if dreams and beliefs can actually shape time and reality? At the end of the day, I think Gaiman intentionally leaves a lot about the Sandman mythos up to the reader's interpretation. But regardless of whether or not the Endless are older than the universe or older than God, they are billions of years old. Like, they existed long before humans or even the Earth existed, and they have probably taken on many different forms throughout their long existence. But the Endless are destiny, death, dream, destruction, desire, despair, and delirium, who used to be known as delight. With Dream or Morpheus or the Sandman being the main character of the series, and he is the king of the dream world. Now, the plot of Brief Lives is it turns out that 300 years ago, Destruction essentially abandoned his post. He abandoned his role as the embodiment of destruction and went into hiding. Now, the other members of the Endless were upset about this, but they respected his wishes and left him alone. But now, 300 years later, Delirium, who is the youngest of the Endless, misses her brother and wants to see him again, so she goes looking for him. At first, she tries to get help from Desire and Despair, both of whom turn her down, so then she turns to Dream, or Morpheus. Now, Morpheus, under normal circumstances, probably would have turned her down as well, but he needs a distraction because he recently got out of a relationship with, apparently, a human woman, and it might seem kind of weird that a being as old and as powerful as Morpheus would be interested in a human woman, but given what we've learned about this character in the other Sandman books leading up to this, it makes perfect sense for this character. So, Morpheus and Delirium enter the human world looking for destruction. Now, it turns out that there are many immortals living among normal humans, and some of these immortals knew destruction in the past. So, Morpheus and Delirium end up looking for these people so they can point them in the direction of their brother, but a lot of these people who can help them end up getting killed. And that's really all I want to say about the plotline of Brief Lives. Now, this is a great addition to this series, and I almost want to say that you could read this without having read the previous volumes. However, in Volume 6, Fables and Reflections, Gaiman incorporated the whole Greek myth of Orpheus into the Sandman mythos, and you found out that Orpheus was actually Morpheus's son. And Orpheus comes back in this book, and you finally see closure between Morpheus and his son, and it's actually pretty heartbreaking. Now, I like how the first half of this is almost like a fish-out-of-water comedy, where you see Dream and Delirium interacting with the human world, and they've certainly entered the human world before, but they still don't know how a lot of things work. Like, there's a really funny scene where Delirium is driving a car, and she's never driven before. And when Delirium starts driving, Morpheus gets his raven Matthew to help her drive. Now, Matthew was a man named Matt Cable before he died, and after he died, instead of going to heaven or hell, he went into the dream world and became Morpheus's pet raven. But because Matthew used to be a human, Morpheus thinks that he would be able to tell his sister how to drive, and it's really funny. Like, at one point, Matthew gets scared that she's gonna kill them, even though he's dead already. But while the book starts out really funny, by the second half, it becomes more of a philosophical drama, and it actually gets really sad. And it's actually something I really love about this series overall, is how this series really does play with genre and tone. Like, the series sometimes goes from being horror to comedy to drama, and it does it seamlessly. Now, Delirium really is sort of the main character of this particular volume of the series, and she's a very likable and very sympathetic character, and she's funny and even adorable at times, even though she does do some morally questionable things. Like, at one point in the story, they encounter a cop, and the cop is a major dick, but given the circumstances, you kinda understand why he's a dick, but what Delirium does to him, I thought was really freaking cruel, and it's like, yeah, the cop was an asshole, but he didn't deserve that. And Morpheus even calls her on it, but then she says, "You've done way worse," which is kind of true. I mean, this is the same guy who condemned a woman to hell for 10,000 years simply because she wouldn't be with him. Also, if you've read the first volume of this series, Preludes and Nocturnes, what he did to the character of Alex Burgess in that first volume, I thought was really freaking cruel. So, the Endless, even though they're the characters we follow throughout this series, in a lot of ways, they're more like anti-heroes than straight-up heroes. And I could totally see the Endless being the villains of somebody else's story. But it's really funny how in the beginning you could tell that Delirium is annoying the piss out of Morpheus, but they do go through an arc with their relationship, which is actually really sweet. Now, you do eventually find out where Destruction is living, and Destruction actually has a talking dog named Barnabas, and I just want to say that Barnabas is freaking awesome. Now, every member of the Endless shows up in this graphic novel at one point or another, and you really do get a sense that they are a family. Sure, they're not humans, but they interact like a human family would. And you also see how close Destruction was to not just Delirium, but Despair as well. And Destruction ends up being a very likable and deep and well-written character. Now, the main theme of this particular volume of the series is really how short life is, even for immortals. Like, in this book you start following characters who are immortal and have existed on the Earth for thousands of years, only to see them get killed or almost killed. Basically, the idea that Neil Gaiman is playing around with here is nothing is permanent. even the gods aren't truly eternal. Like, in the Sandman universe, even though there might certainly be gods who have existed before man, the gods, for the most part, have become so dependent on man's belief in them that a lot of the times when humans stop believing in a certain god, that god dies or has to move on and become something else. And as I said before, the god that the Christians believe in does exist in this universe, and apparently he created the universe, depending on how you want to interpret the mythology. But who knows, maybe even he has a lifespan. And at a certain point in this book, you start following the goddess Ishtar, who it turns out was a former lover of destruction. And she's now living among the humans and is working as a stripper because in order to survive, she needs to have men worship her in another way. Now, I haven't read Neil Gaiman's book American Gods yet, but from what I understand, that book also touches on a lot of similar themes and ideas. In a lot of ways, Neil Gaiman's idea of gods is the exact polar opposite of H.P. Lovecraft's philosophy on gods. Now, Lovecraft had this whole idea that if the gods exist, we are so insignificant to them that when we're gone, the gods will barely even bat an eye, whereas in Neil Gaiman's philosophy, when we're gone, the gods will probably be gone as well. Now, this series is in continuity with Neil Gaiman's graphic novel, The Books of Magic, and in that book, the main character at a certain point is taken billions of years into the future, and it turns out that there will eventually be an end to the universe. It will be billions of years from now, but eventually all life in the universe will extinguish. And when that happens, the Endless, who have existed since the beginning of time, will probably die as well. And that's what's so interesting about this comic, is you have these characters who have existed for thousands, and in some cases, millions or even billions of years, actually contemplating their own mortality. But yeah, once again, Brief Lives is a great graphic novel and is a great addition to this series, and it's thought-provoking and philosophical, but is also hilarious and emotionally moving. And Jill Thompson's artwork in this comic is quite good, especially like when Dream enters Delirium's realm. It's all like psychedelic and shit. Now, this graphic novel also comes with a pretty interesting afterword from Peter Straub. Now, Peter Straub is the author of books like Ghost Story and Floating Dragon, and he also co-wrote the book Talisman with Stephen King. Now, before I end this video, I want to cut to a short review that my friend Mark Allen Gunnels did on this book.
Mark Allen Gunnels here. My friend Christian has asked me to do a short review on the Sandman graphic novel, Brief Lives. As I mentioned, I am a huge fan of the Sandman series. Brief Lives is actually my very favorite story arc in that entire series. I think it's at times hilarious, at times exciting, at times emotional. To me, it's almost a perfect story. In this story arc, actually all the members of the Endless pop up at some point or another, and it's always fun to see them and see how they interact. Actually, the storyline with Morpheus' son, Orpheus, comes to fruition and comes to a very emotional sort of conclusion in this story arc. Definitely, I think it worked wonderfully, and it really then sets up for what becomes sort of the countdown to the end of the entire series. I can't get enough of this. The contrast between the Sandman and Delirium, they're such opposites. Their personalities are so different. So when you put them together, it leads to a lot of really good comedy. And I love the character of Delirium. She talks in these bizarre non sequiturs that sometimes reveal some pretty profound truths, but are often just hilarious. I also like the sort of peaks at destruction and the life he was living. there's a character of his dog Barnabas who can talk, and that character is hilarious. He has some great one-liners. I think this story arc takes you on a real journey. I mean, it's about an actual journey. It's almost like a road trip sort of thing with them seeking out destruction. And like I said, you're gonna laugh. You're gonna get tense with suspense. You're going to get choked up. It really is a great, beautiful story. Well told. I can't say enough about it.
I hope you enjoyed my friend's take on this book, and I hope you enjoyed this video overall, but that was my review on Brief Lives, Volume 7 of the Sandman series by Neil Gaiman, and bye.